Have you ever wondered what would have happened if St. John Paul II, one of the greatest saints of the Catholic Church, had abandoned his calling? What if I told you it almost happened? A secret kept for decades in the Vatican archives reveals that Karol Wojtyła, before becoming Pope, faced such an intense spiritual trial that he nearly gave up everything. What happened in that crucial moment would forever change not only his life but the history of the Church, and possibly your life too. My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, today we're going to dive into a shocking revelation about the life of St. John Paul II. We'll discover the exact moment when he almost abandoned his biblical calling and how God stepped in an extraordinary way. This story, kept secret for years, contains a powerful lesson that can completely transform your spiritual journey, especially if you feel like you're about to give up on the purpose God has for your life. Before we continue with this extraordinary revelation, I want you to drop your name and where you're from in the comments so we can pray for you. If you're facing difficulties in your calling or feel tempted to give up, know that our community will be interceding for you, just as St. John Paul II intercedes for all of us in heaven. Let's go back to Poland in the 1940s, when young Karol Wojtyła faced not only the Nazi occupation, but also a devastating inner conflict. Few know that during World War II, while working at the Solvay factory to avoid deportation, Karol experienced one of the darkest moments of his vocation. In a recently revealed document found in the Pope's personal archives, we discovered that in 1942, after losing his father, the last person in his immediate family still alive, Karol faced what mystics call a dark night of the soul. For 3 months, he couldn't feel God's presence. Doubts tormented him daily. "Am I following the right path?" he wrote in his diary. "When I see so much suffering around me, when I see innocents being taken to concentration camps, when I see evil triumph, I begin to question if there really is a purpose for me in this world of darkness." What few people know is that at that crucial moment, Karol went as far as writing a letter to his spiritual advisor, Cardinal Adam Sapieha, expressing his desire to abandon his underground theological studies. He felt that perhaps he could better serve God and the Polish people as an actor or writer, using art to preserve the Polish culture the Nazis were trying to destroy. The letter was sealed and ready to be delivered. Karol decided to spend one last night in prayer before making his final decision. That's when something extraordinary happened, something he rarely mentioned, but that completely transformed his life. What happened that night reveals a profound biblical principle about God's faithfulness when we face our greatest trials. In the Bible, we find various passages that reveal how God works precisely in the moments when we're about to give up. In 1 Kings 19, we see the prophet Elijah, after a great spiritual victory, running away in fear and asking for death. He was ready to abandon his prophetic calling when God manifested, not in the strong wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in a gentle whisper. This is a biblical pattern rarely explored, but deeply revealing. Similarly, Karol Wojtyła reported that, on that night of spiritual agony, while kneeling before a small improvised altar in his room, he didn't experience any grand vision or booming voice. Instead, he felt what he would later describe as a silent certainty, an inexplicable peace that came with a clear understanding. His calling didn't depend on his feelings or external circumstances. In one of John Paul II's spiritual diaries, revealed only after his canonization, he wrote, "I understood that night that faithfulness to God's calling doesn't mean absence of doubts, but perseverance despite them. I saw that the biblical calling often leads us through dark valleys to test our determination." This experience deeply reflects what the Apostle Paul describes in 2 Corinthians 4:8-9. "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. St. John Paul II developed from this experience a unique understanding of the biblical calling that is rarely taught. He came to believe that God's true calling always goes through a moment of extreme trial, a point where we're tempted to give up. It's precisely at that moment that divine grace manifests itself most powerfully. In his theological writings on vocation, John Paul II frequently returned to a profound interpretation of Abraham's story, who was called to sacrifice Isaac. He saw in this narrative not just a test of obedience, but a spiritual pattern. God asks us to sacrifice our limited understanding of the calling to receive a deeper divine understanding. Now that you're understanding how St. John Paul II faced and overcame this crucial moment in his vocation, I want you to reflect. At what point in your journey are you? Are you about to give up on something God has placed in your heart? Leave your name and where you're from in the comments so we can pray specifically for you and ask for St. John Paul II's intercession that God may renew your strength and conviction in your calling. Let me share with you the testimony of Carlos, a Brazilian seminarian who was about to abandon his vocation after years of study. Carlos was facing a deep spiritual crisis, questioning whether he really had the calling for priesthood. One night, desperate, he picked up a book about John Paul II's life and read precisely about this trial we're sharing today. Inspired by the saint's perseverance, Carlos decided to do a novena to St. John Paul II, asking for clarity about his vocation. On the last day of the novena, he was unexpectedly assigned to help with a mission in an underprivileged community. There, while administering the sacraments to an elderly woman who was dying, he experienced such a profound renewal of his calling that all doubts dissipated. Today, Father Carlos leads a vibrant parish and frequently shares how that moment of almost giving up transformed into the greatest strengthening of his vocation. Another impressive testimony is that of Martha, a teacher who felt called to create an evangelization project in public schools. Facing resistance and bureaucracy, she was about to give up when she came across a teaching from John Paul II about perseverance. Today, her project reaches more than 50 schools and has already transformed thousands of young lives. These are just two examples of how St. John Paul II's spiritual legacy continues to inspire people not to abandon their biblical callings, even when everything seems to indicate they should give up. My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, what have we learned today from this revelation about St. John Paul II? We've learned that the moment when we're most tempted to give up might be exactly the moment that precedes our greatest spiritual victory. If Karol Wojtyła had delivered that letter and abandoned his calling, the world would have lost one of the greatest popes in history, a saint whose influence transformed the church and impacted millions of lives. Think about it. How many people would have lost the opportunity to encounter Christ through John Paul II's ministry if he had given up that night? Similarly, your perseverance in the calling that God has placed in your heart is not just about you, it's about all the people God plans to reach through you. Your biblical calling is greater than your doubts, greater than your fears, greater than the circumstances that seem impossible. As St. John Paul II taught us with his life, be not afraid. Don't be afraid to remain faithful to your calling, even when you don't see the result. Don't be afraid to keep believing, even when everything seems to indicate otherwise. For it is precisely in the darkest moments that God's light shines most intensely in our lives. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this revealing video about one of the most decisive moments in St. John Paul II's life. If this message touched your heart and renewed your determination to follow your biblical calling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to receive more inspiring content like this. Share this video with someone you know who might be going through a moment of doubt in their vocation, and comment below how this revelation about St. John Paul II impacted your life and your understanding of perseverance in the divine calling. May God abundantly bless your journey, and may St. John Paul II's intercession strengthen you to never abandon your biblical calling, especially in moments of greatest trial. Until the next video.